We're going to talk about reporting on Israel from the perspective of four outstanding experienced journalists. Jodi Rudoren, who is the Jerusalem bureau chief for the New York Times, and now she's the editor-in-chief of The Forward.
I was based in Jerusalem from April of 2012 through the end of 2015. That included covering 2 wars in Gaza and 2 Israeli elections. And that was back when we thought that 2 Israeli elections in 3.5 years sounded like a lot. The summer of 2014 was a really, really intense time to be a correspondent there. This spring ramped up with the kidnapping of the 3 Israeli yeshiva students from the West Bank hitchhiking. And then at the end of June, they were found dead. And then there was the kidnapping and killing of a Palestinian teenager the next day. And then about a week later, the war in Gaza started and lasted for 51 days. 2 of the most memorable stories I did in Israel. One was my very first few months there. I did this really interesting front page story about the fact that children and grandchildren of Auschwitz survivors were getting their own tattoos of their survivor relatives' numbers on their arms or legs. That had nothing to do with the conflict, obviously. And then another time, I don't know why I'm picking 2 Holocaust stories, but I also did a story about a Holocaust survivor beauty pageant up in Haifa, which was hilarious in every way and very moving.
We have Ron Kampeas, who's the Washington bureau chief for Jewish Telegraphic Agency, or JTA, which is sort of the Jewish equivalent of the Associated Press. And he, among other things, worked with the AP's Jerusalem bureau.
And it was in 1992. And I just joined the Associated Press as a local hire. And I just sort of listening and trying not to get into trouble. And there was an incident in which a Palestinian from the Gaza Strip stabbed some people to death in Jaffa. It was Purim. It was March in 1992. He also injured some girls who were waiting at a bus stop, but he killed a 19-year-old Israeli woman and an Israeli Arab man, a garage technician who'd rushed out to try and protect her. I was already getting used to the rhythm of how the AP covered the Intifada, as it was still raging then, the first Intifada. And there was a 15-year-old Palestinian who had been killed when he was throwing stones at an armored vehicle in the Gaza Strip. We went through several cycles covering this stabbing attack in Tel Aviv, and this 15-year-old in the Gaza Strip barely, he got a mention. He didn't get a story. And I was thinking, okay, so the answer has to be the boy was putting himself in danger. He was throwing stones. Or just the horror of the attack, people standing in line waiting to go to a Purim party, or the drama of the attack, an Israeli Arab who died protecting a Jewish girl. And Marcus Eliason, the late Marcus Eliason, who was the bureau chief, said the reason we're giving so much more attention to this is because Israel is going to do something major because of this. As news people, you have to look ahead to the next thing. The things that I think outsiders think that you bring to this, some kind of bias. Palestinians would complain that we're not covering the 15-year-old in the Gaza Strip. No, we are looking to cover the stories that are going to have the most consequence the next day. This was right before the election that year, which led to Oslo. Labour looked like it was going to win. This could have added to Likud's firepower in the election. There's any number of things that could have happened. And on the Palestinian side, unfortunately, the death of this 15-year-old wasn't going to make anything different. The Intifada was going to still roar on. I think that gave me the first sort of insider's view of how international journalists cover a story.
Dave Schechter was a producer for CNN, the Jerusalem bureau. And 2 of the past 3 years, he's been named the #2 freelancer in Jewish journalism by the American Jewish Press Association. He writes for, among others, the Atlanta Jewish Times, The Forward, JTA.
Like Ron, I was a local hire. I was in Israel on a study program, which I left because I found work, because I had already been working as a journalist professionally for 7 years. This period when I was there was probably, I don't want to call it the end of an innocence, but it was 85 to 87. You had both Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir rotating as the head of government. We were able to go do stories on culture and art and religion and the other aspects that did not have to do directly with politics and security, although Lord knows we did plenty of that. And just to show you what kind of a person I am, I went back in 88 for 3 weeks on my own dime because I didn't want to miss the Intifada.
Jan Jaben-Eilon is a freelance reporter and editor. He lived in Israel in the mid-1990s and probably writes more about what's going on in Israel now that she lives in Atlanta.
I went to Israel not to work, but to live. I had to make a living, and it was not going to be about reporting Israel. I didn't have the contacts for that, but I had been editor of Crane's Business Marketing and I left my job as international editor of Advertising Age. So I had a lot of contacts in Israel. I had done some stories. So I found some work doing freelance for some high-tech companies in Israel. I'll never forget seeing an article in the Jerusalem Post versus the English Haaretz, I think it was, and just seeing the difference of how the Israeli media reported on it. And reporting on it from here, it's frustrating. Trying to explain the Israeli political system or trying to give American Jews context. They talk about how many times they've been to Israel, how many trips, and that seems to be their marker for how much they know about Israel.
One of the interesting things about Israel is how much attention it gets in the media internationally. Why do we think that is?
Again, just the consequences of what happens in Israel reverberate so strongly. There are things that we obviously see in terms of how any kind of conflict in Israel can scuttle other things. So now we're looking at how the Biden administration is worried about what's going on in Israel now because it wants to pull Saudi Arabia back into the fold. Saudi Arabia is skeptical of the Biden administration's plans. And so they're making nice with Iran, which is something that the West doesn't want, Biden doesn't want. And a conflagration now in Israel would undercut that. Those are the kinds of consequences that, again, unfortunately, internecine violence in Syria or Iraq are not going to bring about, or they're not going to bring it about as immediately and consequentially. I think that's one big reason for the focus. And the other reason is it's the land of the Bible. People are fascinated by it.
I agree with what Ron said, but I think a couple things to note too. One is this used to be a lot more true than it is now. And I think it kind of changed with the Trump era. The sort of center of gravity for news moved. It was even more true in Ron's time, and maybe back in Dave's time, and certainly around Oslo and in the Second Intifada. By the time I got there in 2012, I think they told me that the number of credentialed foreign correspondents had been like 500 in Jerusalem. And I think it was down to like 70 or something like that. It was like still the second most after Washington, but it was radically fewer. And I wrote many, many, many more stories per year for the New York Times than my successors have. Again, the center of gravity of where the news map is has just shifted in the Trump era. Then with COVID, with tech, now with Ukraine on a per capita basis, Israel and the Palestinians have certainly gotten more coverage over the years. And in addition to what Ron said, or just maybe components of what Ron said, I would add a few things to think about. One is, as he said, the land of the Bible. This is a place that is critically important to billions of Muslims and Christians around the world, as well as Jews. Number two, everything else in America is also sort of oversaturated in Israel, right? The military aid to Israel per capita is the highest in the world. The philanthropic investment in Israel is the highest compared to any place else in the world. Also, tech investment and investment in Startup Nation is very high. Travel to Israel among Americans is relatively high. Jewish American influence on the media is significant. I'm careful with my words there too. It's all kind of symbiotic. I think the media coverage reflects the exaggerated interest that American audiences have in this place, political audiences, business audiences, religious audiences, all of those people are more interested in Israel than, say, Jordan.
People would say, you don't cover this, you don't cover that. And I'm going, well, yes, we did. We filed pieces on that. We had this interview, that program. The one other reason that I think there is so much coverage, Israel welcomes the journalists. You can go, you can live, you can set up residence, you can work. It is relatively secure. You're not putting your correspondence security at as much risk as you would in Syria, in Lebanon. There are parts of the Arab world, for example, where getting into the country is either very difficult or not possible. Now, things are changing a bit with the Abraham Accords for some of those countries, but the numbers have gone down, and you do see a shift. And one of the things I wanted to suggest about that shift, with the demographic shifts in the United States, a larger percentage of the population being Hispanic, a larger percentage of the population being Asian, at some point, I wonder whether the people making decisions on how you staff and how you apportion time and resources say, we have millions more people who have family and historic ties in these countries, and we need to provide them more coverage from those countries than perhaps elsewhere. And maybe we siphon a little bit off from the Middle East. Although, as Ron points out, all it takes is one matchstick in the Middle East and everybody floods in.
I will add one quick thing, and that is that from a journalist point of view of living in Israel, it's such a fast-paced country and culture, and there's always something going on. There's always news. It's just amazing to live there and know that there's always going to be something to write about. Your editors may not be interested. That's another question. Your audience may not be interested, but from the journalist point of view, it's wonderful to live there.
Laura King, who was a kind of within the AP, a legendary journalist, now she works for the LA Times. I remember coming to work at the Jerusalem Bureau, and she'd come straight from Japan, and she said, "My God, in Japan, try and go get Vox Populi for a story, try and get quotes in the street. People run away. I step out of the office here, people flood me. I want to." So Israel's a very, very journalist-friendly country in that sense, because that everybody wants to give you their opinion. Everybody wants to speak and share their experience. It's something I really miss.
With all those reporters there and their freedom to cover things, how well are they presenting a full picture of Israel and Israel's neighbors?
I won't speak to the reporting on a particular network or particular individuals, but I'll say this. Jodi, having been with the New York Times, may not agree. Television comes in for harsher criticism. Part of that is the television news report, the minute and a half, the 2.5 minutes, does not lend itself to presenting history or context or nuance or subtlety, the kind of depth that one would get reading. Could be the Jerusalem Report, could be reading a lengthy piece from JTA, could be reading the New York Times, could be reading any number of print publications. Television, because of its dependence on pictures that move, pictures that grab, does not help the quest to provide the context and the background. My attitude has always been that a well-done television piece will send me to the newspaper. It'll send me to the magazine. If the piece is that good, I want to know more, because I know there's a limitation to what you can do in 2.5 minutes on television.
The problem is not the media necessarily presenting the news. I really do feel like the audience does need to learn how to digest the news, how to look at the nuances, like Dave was saying. When I taught a course on the media in the Middle East, what I always advise them is, whatever the story is of the day, look at as many media as possible and try to gain more information from each of them, because no one story is going to cover the whole story. You have to look at the different sources and then try to make up your mind. People are always saying one media is biased or another one is, but you have to read them all and then try to make up your own mind of what's really going on there.
I'm going to push back a little bit on the structure of your question, because I think that to try to assess how the media as a whole does anything is futile and probably unfair. A lot of activists who care a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have decided that the media is biased or the big media is biased or whatever. My hypothesis is that the media outlets that are good, however you define it, are mostly just as good at covering Israel as they are at covering everything else. What I want out of the media is independence, breadth of perspective, on-the-ground reporting, integrity around the truth, and a sort of 360 view of a complicated situation. My experience has been that the outlets that I seek out that do that kind of journalism, the best ones are good at this beat and other beats, and the worst ones are not at this or any others. When you start to feel yourself thinking about this or any other topic, this source that I trust so much in general and that I read every day or watch every day and love and think is really interesting, on this topic that I'm so invested in, I find their coverage biased. When you say that, you should check yourself and be like, oh, wait, maybe I know too much or care too much about the outcome of this particular story to really assess how the media is doing. The main stuff of a news organization is the things people are fighting over. And as Ron has now said, both succinctly and insightfully, the things that have real consequences.
As I said, I went back on my own dime when the Intifada happened. And I would say that the first Intifada may have been the inflection point at which coverage changed and it became not majority, although it did probably get to that point, but increasingly about the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And that shoved to the side the culture, the history pieces, the education pieces. And I think that with the first, and certainly then with the second Intifada, it's never gone back. But to what Jodi said, you can find this. If the network or the newspaper that you read isn't doing it, because of the way the media is structured now, because there are websites that focus almost exclusively on these topics, you can find it.
If you did a per capita analysis of stories, I bet there are more feature stories, feature culture, non-conflict stories about Israel than any other country on earth. As a reflection of the things we talked about earlier, there are more correspondents based there. So each of them does some in their spare time. And we know that people are really interested in that. I mean, think about all that you know about Israeli television. There's a ton of travel pieces. There's stuff about nightlife. Oh my God, how much do we know about Israeli food? Israeli chefs. It's everywhere.
The reason you have local hires is that you want somebody who's steeped in the country, who's lived there a long time, who speaks the language. And it's true of any country. It's not just true of Israel. And you want the stories that tell us something a little bit deeper about the country. Again, going back to my AP days, the first time that they kept my lead, which I was very proud of, was a story about how they were selling pizza from an underground cellar in Bnei Brak, which is an ultra-Orthodox city, because you weren't allowed to have pizza because the rabbis said it was too sensuous. And if you had pizza parlors, girls could meet boys. And so they were delivering pizza, but you weren't allowed to actually know where they were delivering it from. And we deliver, said David of Speed Pizza, but I can't reveal our location. Those are the instructions. The location is a secret. It's a story about delivering pizza in a Tel Aviv suburb on one hand, but it's also a story that tells a story about Israel, about this massive subculture, the Haredi subculture, and how they react and how they live in the modern world, and how sometimes the temptations of pizza can be too strong to resist. That's the way I think that you set yourself apart. You go for the stories that make you love the country a little bit, whatever country you're in.
I felt that it was very unlikely that any analysis piece that I was going to write was going to there was really not anything new to say about the big picture of what was going on. But it felt to me, if I could break things down and humanize them a little bit, that people might have a little bit of a deeper understanding of what it really felt like on the ground.
My readers say they love Israel. They care about Israel. They've gone to Israel. But how do I teach them something? I see my job partly as a journalist to be a teacher too, to educate, to try to explain, to elucidate, to make them care in a different way, to make them care in a deeper way. And that you can only do if you really get into a story.
What news sources do you turn to coming out of the Middle East?
I am not a Hebrew speaker. I don't read Hebrew, not fluently. But in terms of what I follow, I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, I read the Los Angeles Times, I read JTA, I read Forward, I read Tablet. I will read almost anything if I trust. I read Times of Israel, I read Haaretz. There are some news operations that are advocacy as much as they are news. I'm not going to name them. They are on the far right of the American-Israeli nexus and on the far left. I see what they do, but I don't necessarily trust it because of the foundation that it's coming from.
The last thing I do at night before I shut off the light is reading Israeli news from Israel. I read those publications that Dave talked about, but I have to say that I get most of my news from Israeli publications. And then I read the New York Times the next day and see, is there anything I haven't already learned? And the other part of it is they present it in a different light or something. You know, it opens up your mind a little bit.
I read the Washington Post because it's my home paper. I read the New York Times because I subscribe. Those are good comprehensive papers, but specifically for the Middle East, the Times of Israel is just very fast. They get stuff up very, very fast. I want to know what's going on. And I do speak Hebrew and I read Hebrew. If there's a terrorist attack in Israel, God forbid, or something is breaking in Israel, I will turn on Kan News, which is still the best broadcast outlet. It's the government-run agency, KAN, or Reshet Bet, which is what it used to be called, what it's still kind of called.
I feel like probably all of us read and watch and kind of are aware of what publications are doing about Israel as much to understand the journalism about Israel as to understand what's going on there. I would add to the Diet plus 972, which is a reliable left-wing magazine that you want to know what they're doing.
The people who cover Israel best are the organizations that cover the news best. What worries me is that the more organizations that cut back or scale back, the fewer of those credible organizations there will be putting boots on the ground in Israel, which does leave the coverage to what you might call advocacy news organizations.
You do need a cadre of publications and outlets that have standards. Sometimes we're going to get it wrong, but we're going to correct ourselves, as opposed to others who are just going to go on, and there's less and less distinction. I'll get challenged on Twitter, like, how come you're not covering such and such a story by this crazy partisan outlet? It doesn't call the other side, or it doesn't try and get it. Because I don't do that. That's not what I do.
When you finish reading a good piece of journalism, particularly about something that you do care about, hopefully your reaction will be like, I never thought of it that way, or I didn't know that. And we want to keep trying to deliver that to you to make sure that everything we publish has some kind of thoughtful, insightful, respectful, explanatory take that adds some value to your knowledge base. And what we need from the audience is to come to us from a place of curiosity and inquiry, so that you are coming to a news source to try to find out more, to get a deeper understanding, get more nuance, get more complexity, instead of seeking a kind of, oh yeah, I was right all along.